حلقة جديدة من أمسية الإجراءات اللي تقدمها ES Consulting. سعيدين جدا بحضوركم ونشكركم، ونتمنى بإذن الله أنها تكون حلقة جدا مميزة. معنا اليوم الخبير المعروف، خبير إجراءات العمل، خبير إدارة العمل، السيد روجر تريقير. راح يتكلم عن موضوع جدا جدا مهم ويمس كثير من اللي لهم علاقة في إدارة العمل وخاضوا مشاريع إدارة العمل. راح يتكلم عن عن موضوع توثيق إجراءات العمل، وهل فعلا نحتاج لتوثيق إجراءات العمل بالشكل اللي قاعد يصير الآن عندنا في المشاريع هذه. وش الفائدة المرجوة من مشاريع توثيق إجراءات العمل. راح أترك المجال للسيد روجر تريقير، وأتمنى إن شاء الله أن تكون محاضرة جدا مفيدة خلال الساعة القادمة. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to have you today. We have a live webinar with Mr. Roger Tregear, who is going to talk about process modeling, why we are modeling our processes. I will leave the floor to Mr. Roger Tregear. Hello, Roger, and thank you for this webinar. The floor is yours.
Thank you, AbdulRahman. Thanks to you and the team for organising this webinar, and welcome to all of those that have joined. Big long list of people there. It's very good of you to attend to talk about this really important topic about modelling. It's perhaps a smaller part of process-based management, but obviously a very important part. So I'm pleased to be able to contribute here today. So the question is, why model? And we'll talk about that and why it's important and what we should and shouldn't do, perhaps. And also perhaps even what is a model, just to expand a little beyond the perhaps the obvious and ordinary perception of what a process model is. So AbdulRahman perhaps just explained a little to you about who I am, so I won't go over that. I'm a BPM consultant and educator. I do lots of work for lots of different organisations, have done for the last 20 years, and you can see a few logos on that slide that you will recognise. I've been working with various organisations, partner organisations around the world for a long time. That's how I operate in countries outside of my immediate area, and it's been my privilege to work with the ES group for, well, since as long as they've existed. So we've been doing projects for, I guess it must be, is it 14 or 15 years now? It's a long time. And that's worked very well, and I look forward to it continuing. I'm here in Australia. Down in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, you can see the big red dot, and I'm just somewhere under that big red dot. My office is here it's a little village called Bungendore, actually, which is just outside of Canberra, the national capital. It's about 20 kilometres from Canberra. And Canberra is about 300 kilometres southwest of Sydney. So I'm down there in my studio and office, and pleased to be joining you today. So the whole point of this series of webinars is to pick out some of the topics from my most recent book, Process Provocations. You can find that book in various places. It's a free download. It's certainly on my website. Perhaps it's on the ES website. And AbdulRahman is organising for it to be translated into Arabic. And I look forward to seeing that sometime in 2021. It will be great to see that book in Arabic and available again as a free download for all of you. So, and the point of that book was that it's a series of posts that I did on LinkedIn over 42 weeks, in fact, to just put forward a brief idea, a bit of a provocation, if you like. So we've included that in the book, there's that post, and then there's some other commentary there. They're all independent thoughts, separate chapters. You can delve into it anytime you like and just pick a chapter and have a think about that. What we're doing today is what is this page 33 of the book. It was the post called Why Model. So that's what we'll cover today. And then we've got a series of these in most months of the year to just cover over a new topic. If you've got any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll pick them up before we finish. So, what's the value of process modeling? We do a lot of modeling, don't we? You know, it's true across thousands of organizations. Tens of thousands of people create process models, and millions of people use them. It's a very labor-intensive business, a very important part of process management and improvement to actually create the models in the first place. But then many, many more people are using those. So around the world, we literally have very large numbers of people spending a lot of time, investing a lot of time in these process models. So what's the value of that? Why do we do that? And not just the traditional process model either, but all sorts of other documentation. And we'll talk about that a little as well. So what is that? What are we trying to do? Why is it? How can we get the best return on that very significant investment that we put into process modeling? The first thing we need to acknowledge is that there's no organization on the planet that has a business problem called we don't have enough process models. That's not a business problem. The process model is a tool, and it needs to be a tool to achieve some business outcome. And the business outcome will be about better understanding, the ability to improve a process, the ability to standardize a process, the ability to make the most out of what other people have learned about similar processes. But the models themselves are not a solution to a business problem. It's not. Your organizations aren't going around saying, we have this big business issue that we don't have enough process models. It's a tool, a means to an end. So we need to be careful about that. What is the end? And we need to be checking all the time to make sure that the vast amount of time and effort that goes into process modeling of various sorts is actually worth it, and we're delivering good value, and we can prove that we are. So broadly, I think we would say there are two valid reasons to produce process models of any sort. The first of these is to elucidate. So we want to just use a model so that we can understand the detail, build a richer understanding of the process, how it works, perhaps down even into some fine detail if we need to, but just to build that understanding. And then we can share that understanding so that everybody's got a common understanding of what the process is supposed to do and how it works and how all the logic is played out within the process. One reason for doing that, of course, might be that we want to improve the performance of the process. There's some problem or perhaps some opportunity, and we want to know how we can use some perhaps new technology in the process, or how we can identify some problem, performance problem in the process. We might also use a process model to elucidate the whole issue around risk, because now that we've got the detail and we know what the process, how it's supposed to work, how it is working, now we can say, okay, how do we test this for risk events? What is it that could go wrong? And organizations with good process models are able to do that. Of course, you need an accurate model that's known to be accurate to be able to do that. Otherwise, it's just plain dangerous, of course. But you can go through the model and say, what could change? What would happen here or here or here? What is it that could change about the operation of this model that would cause some unwelcome event? So that's the first reason, to elucidate, just to understand, to redesign, to control the process. But also, and just as importantly, we might want to use our process models, create them, and then use them to communicate information, to train new staff as a reference source for all the staff, so that everyone has the same access to the same material, so that we can be certain that everyone is trying to do it in the same way. And there's some certification processes that would require us to be able to demonstrate, to show our process models as well. So just to communicate information about the process to new staff, to existing staff, so that we can standardize the way we do something. If we find the one best way of doing it, then we want to be able to show that to people and let them understand how it should be done in that one best way. And then also to get, certification for some kind of, business excellence certifications will require some process. Most quality assessments these days would require you to demonstrate that you understand your processes and that you're following them and can manage them well. So I think these are the two general reasons why we might want to model, to elucidate and to communicate. And we need to be, when we're producing a model of any sort, we need to be thinking about what are we doing? Which or both of those are we supposed to be doing for the particular modelling that we're doing? Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons that are not good reasons for doing modelling. You occasionally hear people say, we will model all of our processes. And the appropriate response to that is just to ask, why would you do that? I mean, all of our processes, that's thousands of processes. If you're not going to actively manage a process, then, in general, there's not much benefit in having a process model that was put together 6 months ago and no one's looked at since. It might even be dangerous, because someone will find that and think it's a accurate model, and it may not be if it hasn't been looked at for 6 months. Probably isn't. So model all our processes? No, I don't think so. I think we've got to get focused. One of the things about process-based management is that it doesn't matter who you are, what organization, how big you are, you have a limited set of resources for process analysis, modeling, improvement, process management. And yet that limited set of resources needs to be applied to what is effectively an infinite space. Because we've got hundreds, if not thousands of processes, depending how deep we go into the process architecture. So, we have to make choices, and we want them to be wise choices. So we want to focus. And anything that will help us get focus is going to be useful. And just modeling, just in case rather than just in time, it seems like a waste of time to me. If we think we might need the model sometime later, well, let's create the model sometime later. Once you've built a capability to produce a model in reasonably quick time, then that's not hard to do. And the model you produce now maybe isn't accurate anyway when you actually come to need it later on. So, let's model just in time, not just in case. And, everybody's doing it, everybody's modeling, so we better get in on the act. That's obviously not a good enough reason to invest large amounts of resources into creating lots and lots of models. We spent a lot of money on the modeling tools, therefore we need to produce lots of models. There's a bit of strange calculus, which is, if we've produced 1,000 models, we've done better. We've got more use out of the modeling tool than if we produced 500 models. Well, that's only true if we needed 1,000 models, and we probably don't. So all the time we want to be saying, where's the return on modeling? And, some of our project plans, some organizations say you've got to produce process models as you go. And, somewhere along the project, sometimes even at the end of the project, someone says, oh, we need to produce those models so that we can tick that box. Well, that's not what it's about, is it? It's not about ticking boxes. It's about building deep understanding of the performance of key processes so that we can actively manage them, and in doing so, then mindfully improve their performance. That's why we're doing all of this work. So lots of reasons there not to do it. The principles of modelling excellence was something that in this form was developed by my former colleague Sandy Johal back in our days together at Leonardo Consulting. Some of you know Sandeep. He visited Saudi Arabia a couple of times to do some project work. So this has 9 aspects, and some of you are also familiar with this from subsequent work that ES and ModPrex have done. But this was an attempt to define modelling excellence and to raise the quality of models and modelling so that people are getting a much better return on modelling. And if I start up here in the top right here, you know, we want to define a purpose. Whenever we're modelling, we need a purpose. You know, again, it's modelling for a purpose, not just modelling just in case, but modelling just in time and having clear understanding of why anyone's going to be better off if we complete this process model. And then we need to determine the depth and breadth of the model that we're trying to produce. You know, which process is it? Where does it start? Where does it finish? So some scope of modelling is going to be important. I'll come back to the modeller's dilemma in a moment with another slide. You will know if you've done any modelling at all with repository-based tools that modelling conventions are going to be important, because we want lots of people to be able to create models eventually, and we want some consistency in those models. So we want to know what sort of model types and what attributes need to be maintained at various levels of a process architecture. And down the bottom there, the next one around, we need to be modelling within a process architecture because we need to understand the context of the process. You know, no process lives alone, so we want to understand how we can locate the process in the midst of this complex ecosystem of processes, and that's what the process architecture lets us do. There is a life cycle, of course, to a process model. It goes through various stages of early development and drafting and approval and maybe review and update, and we need to be able to maintain some control over all of that. The most dangerous thing that we can have in the process space, I think, is a process model that's actually wrong because it's out of date, but we think it's correct. That's always going to cause us grief. So we need some control over all of those process models. And that's another reason for only having the process models that we really need, isn't it? Because controlling them might be more complicated, more demanding than creating them in the first place if we're not careful. We need to have some way of focusing on the quality of the model. So, you know, are we producing high quality models so that they're accurate and they're useful? And there are various ways of doing that, but we need to make sure we can actively measure and manage quality. And a lot of our processes or sub-processes reoccur, don't they, throughout the process architecture. So we want to be able to reuse models as much as we can. If it's a common process, it should have a common process model, because we don't want to end up with what is essentially the same process, but it's been modeled differently in 2 different places and nobody realized, and now we've got 2 process models which are representative of effectively the same process. And all the time, of course, because we're using up resources and we're wanting people to get involved, we need to be actively selling the benefits of all of this modeling. As process practitioners, we might think it's really interesting and it's good fun and we love it. But, you know, many of our colleagues in the other parts of the organization aren't so keen on process modeling. It's oh no, not another modeling workshop. So we have to be able to sell the benefits of it, because the costs of doing so will be pretty obvious to people, but maybe not the benefits. So we have to be able to demonstrate that. So that's just a quick run through of the 9 elements of modeling excellence, but it requires us to take an active management role in process modeling. You know, it's not just about drawing diagrams. These are management tools we're creating. So I have a question from Mohammed that says, what's the criteria to choose which processes need to be modeled? So that's a tough question, isn't it? Because, you know, the ones, what about the ones we don't model? Maybe that's just the ones we needed. So there's no easy answer to this. It's not a, you know, like you can whack a whole bunch of stuff in a spreadsheet and it will come up with a magic answer. It's not like that. But certainly what organizations doing these days more and more is identifying their high impact processes. And even for a large organization, that might be 20 or 30 processes. So that's a good starting point. You would certainly want to model a process if you're analyzing it, if you need to. There's some performance problem or some opportunity that would require you to first build an understanding of what's happening now before you start changing it, of course. There might be a process where there's a problem, an obvious problem that needs to be addressed. And, you know, as long as you're producing process models that have a purpose, you know, that we're addressing some known opportunity or problem, or they're the high impact processes that we want to actively manage, whatever's going on, then you're doing good work. So I think the issue usually is that we've got fewer resources to apply to process modeling than we might like. So we're going to have to prioritize. So we can easily get to the top priorities, and we don't have much spare capacity after that anyway. So I think there's no magic answer to how we prioritize the processes, except to say some will be high impact and we will want to model those and maintain those all the time. And then there'll be other occasions where there's an opportunity we want to explore or a problem that we've got to explore, and that will let us dive down into those. Now, I said we'll put modeler's dilemma aside for a moment, so let's get back to that. So the modeler's dilemma, and this is Sandeep's contribution. He says that we need to look at three aspects. He called them semantic, pragmatic, and syntactic aspects of a process model. And in simple terms, it's just saying the semantic is it accurate? You know, does it actually reflect reality? Is the model actually describing what happens in real life? Is it useful? I mean, is this a model that people can use for some good purpose? And syntactic is simply asking if it's compliant with modeling conventions and other rules of modeling. And obviously we want to achieve as much as we can of all of those. So that sweet spot, the overlap of semantic, pragmatic, and syntactic is where we want to be aiming all the time to really increase the quality of the models. You know, what we would like to do is always be producing high quality models that meaningful, useful, and are consistently applying a set of rules so that all of the models that we're producing have some similarity, and that we can easily read one or the other, and we can combine them, and we can, you know, there's all sorts of nice ways of pulling those together so that we've got eventually a consistent and coherent set of process models that are describing a large part of the process architecture. So that's the modeler's dilemma. We need to get all three of those as much as we possibly can. Now, what about beyond traditional models? So the EPCs or the BPMN is what we would normally think of, I guess, as a process model. But there are lots of ways of modeling, producing other forms of documentation. And I talk about the process management record, which will include, or in addition to the process models, we would have a set of information that would include things like a well-structured process definition, a description, you know, what is this process about? Some analysis of the stakeholders, a context diagram, perhaps a process behavior chart, I'll go through each of these in a little more detail in a moment. Some details about the process KPIs and their targets, and a summary of any actions that we're taking to have an impact on performance of that process. So it's about building this rich understanding of what the process is about, particularly those high impact processes, the ones that we've selected for active process management. It's not just about drawing a model here and there, but it's about, as well as that, building up our knowledge about all of the other pieces around the model, all of those resources, the performance, the issues, the challenges that the process has, so that we've got a very good mental model of what the process is about, what it's trying to do, why it's important, to whom is it important, and why is it important to them? All of these questions we need to have a very good understanding of if we're going to optimize performance. And I summarize all of that. I call it the process management record. And sometimes that can be an actual document, just pull all these things together, or maybe it's a dispersed data set. But really what I'm saying is this kind of information that I would like a process owner to have, as well as just the traditional process models. So a process description, now that might sound like a fairly trivial thing to do. For those of you whom I've worked with will know that when we're putting a process architecture together, we like to capture the process description, a little short description for every process as we go, because inevitably when you end up with hundreds of processes, there'll be some confusion about what was actually meant by that process if you don't capture it pretty quickly after it's been named. So this is an example here. This is a process here. We're evaluating some proposals that have been received. And this is what I mean by a process description. We don't want to write a full page about it. We just a short paragraph. But a good way to think about it is those 5 W's. Just in brief form, without any particular formula for how to do it, but in brief form, just make sure we've covered, who does this, what it's about, why it's important, perhaps where it's done, and when it's done. We can end up with some process descriptions, that are very cryptic. The evaluate proposal process evaluates the proposals. Now, that's not much of a description, is it? That didn't help anyone. And I confess to have written descriptions like that sometimes, but I try not to these days. I try to capture it in this kind of form. So we know here that this is done by it involves the grant applicants and the grants management section of this particular agency, government agency it was. What it's about assessing received proposals. We do it so that we can prioritize funding grants, and there's a time range here from when it's done. So, that's just it's a simple thing, and it's easy enough to do if you're talking to people who, deeply understand the process. We can come up with that very easily, but we should do. Otherwise, we miss an opportunity to just capture a nice description. And that might be the sort of description that you would put into your modeling tool as well, where there's a description of an element. That might be exactly what you can pop in there. So that's process description. We just want, strike a balance. We still want them short descriptions, but we want to cover the 5 W's. A process context diagram, or if you're a BP Trends student, you'll know this is a scope diagram. And BP Trends got the scope diagram from Roger Belton, and it was in those days, in the early days of BP Trends, it was called an IGO diagram for inputs, guides, outputs, and enablers. And I'll just whiz through this quickly because we don't have time to do it in detail, and you've probably seen some of this before. But if we had a process called make coffee, these are the sub-processes of make coffee. You can see up the top left-hand corner now, we say what triggers the request, and then top right, how it finishes. So it's triggered by a request for coffee, and it's completed when the coffee is delivered. And then we're just going to go around the outside and we're going to say, what are the outputs? Well, obviously a cup of coffee, but not just that. We'll have the dirty utensils, we'll have usage data, we'll have waste. So they're all genuine outputs from the process. Then we can identify the inputs, the request for coffee, ingredients, water, energy. So these things are inputs. They're transformed in some way to the outputs. We'll have guides, there's a recipe, coffee machine, manual, kitchen rules, and we're always saying where the output goes to and where any of these inputs, guides, or enablers comes from. And the same we can do for enablers, the machinery and the things that enable us to make the transformation of inputs into outputs. And just when we build this up, and this is a model, I know it's not what we might commonly think of as a process model, but it is a model of some sort. And it's a very powerful way of understanding a process. And we're back to that point about understanding. So this is what we want to be able to do. And then you might do this before you even start doing the traditional models. And once we've got this, then we can ask all sorts of other questions. We can say, where are the problems and opportunities? And we could also use this graphic form to start thinking about what we need to measure, where the KPIs might be and where the priority issues are, etc. So it's a nice graphic way. I use this tool all the time. I think this is probably one of the most powerful tools we have in the process management space, just to be able to understand the process. If you were explaining a process to me, I would most likely be sketching one of these out, even if it's just on a bit of paper for my benefit rather than standing up. But it's a good tool to use, as you will know if you've done the BP Trends training. And I, by the way, call it a process context diagram. I like that term because it just shows how the process fits into the rest of your processes and the rest of the world. So you can see over here that we've got some boxes on the outside with procure supplies, and the modeling notation is that where it's got round corners like that, it's a process. So it also comes from our own process architecture. So the ingredients, an output of procure supplies is the ingredients we use. And the usage data over on the output side, this usage data is going off to that same process. And waste is being dealt with by this process called reuse waste. So we start to see how the thing fits into its context. That's why I like that. Now, stakeholder matrix, this gets skipped a bit too often, I think, when we're doing process work, but important for us to firstly just understand who the stakeholders are. So this is an example for a process recruit employee. And a stakeholder matrix is another form of documentation. And it's just as important to have this as it is to have the traditional models. So we would first list all of the stakeholders that we can think of. And we get to that list perhaps by thinking, who is it that gets something from the process or gives something to the process? So I won't go through all of these in huge detail, but we can see here all the usual kind of people and entities that would be involved in this recruit employee process. And then we can say what they get from and give to the process. And all of this will find a home, of course, won't it, in our process, traditional process model. And then for each stakeholder, we want to know what their objectives are, what they want to experience in the execution of this process. Now, then we need to be able to pull that together, to synthesize all of those individual objectives into a single set, because we need a single set of objectives for the process. So we'll just, then we can have an overall set. And that's what we would take on further to form the KPIs and targets. So stakeholder analysis is important, isn't it? I mean, we're improving processes for stakeholders, so we better understand who they are and what they want out of the process. It's just as important as having some process model. Now, a process behavior chart, or sometimes called an XMR chart or X chart, is a powerful piece of work. It's a very important tool that we should be making a lot more use of. It just lets us present the data, analyze the data. We don't have time to go through it all in huge detail here. If you went to my website, you could find that paper. It's called Signals in the Noise. It's in English. Sorry for that. Maybe we can get some of those translated someday. But a process behavior chart, we plot the data. This is just the time series of outputs. The green line, the central line as it's called in a PBC, is the average of the data points, simple average. And then the upper and the lower natural process limits are calculated They're not targets. We don't just set them. They're calculated based on the data. And they will tell us that if this process is stable, it will perform 99.73% of the time. Each measure will be between the upper and the lower process limits, unless something changes in the process. So we can plot that, and then what we're doing is looking for signals that something has changed. And there's ways in which we can, very simple ways in which we can do that in the data. So it's just a lovely way of presenting this, because it's not just about saying what did happen, but the management goal really isn't to know what happened last week. It's to know or to predict what's going to happen next week. Yeah. And that's what a manager wants to do, predict what's going to happen next week and make appropriate decisions based on that. And a process behavior chart will let us do that in a very nice way. And we might, in another webinar down the track, spend a bit more time just looking at PBCs in particular, because it's a very powerful tool. It's easy enough to do. All we need is the data, and then it's some very simple calculations and simple analysis steps to find the signals in the noise. And we're looking for signals that something has changed about the process performance, something that we were either expecting because we had made a change to the process and we were expecting the performance to change, or maybe it's unexpected. We hadn't known of any changes that had happened, but there's a change in performance, and we might want to go off then and find out why that was. And here's where an example of the sorts of things that we might want to collect about our process. Again, this is a form of a model. It's a whole documentation. It's shown here as a series of tables. They're actually word tables, but I don't mean you have to use that. This is the sort of information we need to collect. So we've got a process description, perhaps some summary of its current status, but importantly there through the middle, we've defined KPIs. And not just named the KPI and set a target, but we want to have some understanding of how we're going to get the data, what the current performance is, as current as we've got it, and what's the impact of closing or not closing the gap. So this is the active part of active process management. We're building all of the time, looking to build deep understanding of the process performance. Now you can see these KPIs have just been given ID numbers, just 1, 2, 3, and then every action that's happening anywhere by anyone that's impacting on any of those KPIs, we can record it here. So the same KPI ID. So these two actions are happening for this first KPI, and then here's one for the second, and another two happening for the third KPI. Now, this is just a simple example, made simple to fit it on a slide, but this is the kind of information that we want to have, isn't it? This is what good process-based management looks like. This is what good process modeling and documentation looks like. We actually have a very good understanding, a deep understanding of what's going on, what's important, what's working not so well, what's really working well, and all of the things that anybody is doing to have an impact on that. Here's a question. This is a very important question, isn't it? I went to very, very early in my process career. I was at a small conference in Sydney, and someone who ran process office for a large organisation asked this question. They said, if someone deleted all of your process models today, what impact would that have? Would the organisation notice? Who would notice? And who would care? That's a sobering thought, isn't it? Because if you think, well, if they were all deleted, not too many people would notice or care, and the organisation would just keep going without even any kind of hiccup. That would be a bit sad, wouldn't it? Given all the time and effort we put into modelling of various sorts. So, it's a test, isn't it, to say how much value do people put in our process models? And if our answers to this question is what impact, not much, who would notice, hardly anyone, who would care, even fewer. If that's the answers, then we better start thinking about why we're doing that process modeling, because I'm not saying we shouldn't model. Of course, we need to model, we need to understand, we need to be able to build deep understanding of our process models, but everybody else needs to understand that as well. These things need to be valued. Otherwise, we're going to run out of budget at some point and everyone will change their focus, and we would have put lots and lots of time and money into producing process models, and then it will all just wither and people won't care anymore. So it's not relevant. It's not seen to be solving any problem that they've got. It's just a nuisance value. So that's a tough question. I'd encourage you to think about that and talk about it in your groups. If all your process models got deleted right now, what would be the impact? Now, if the impact is not much, then you need to think about how those models are being used, because you need to find a much more valued use for them if the whole thing is going to be worthwhile and sustained. So here's a kind of overview of process performance management, and this is why we want to model, isn't it? In large part, it's a major input into this kind of sequence. And it's got three layers to this. We firstly want to understand strategy so that we can build the architecture, the process architecture. So we're dealing here with all of the processes. Maybe we've just named them here, but no, this is giving us the hierarchy of processes from top down, from the vision, mission, or whatever other form strategy takes. So that was dealing with all of the processes. Now we can go on a process by process basis, those high impact processes perhaps, and say, if this process was doing everything its key stakeholders would like it to do, what would it be doing and how would we know? That's the question. That's the process KPI question. So what do stakeholders want from the process? We're getting that out of the matrix, the stakeholder matrix. What are the process KPIs? How would we track those objectives? And what are the targets for those KPIs? So that defines performance for us. This gives us a framework for each process about how to think about performance. Now, though, we need to manage that performance, don't we? We don't want to stop there. It's not a matter of just creating a bunch of KPIs and targets and moving on. We did that so that we can use them. So now we want to be always looking for that problem or opportunity gap. And we want to understand what that means. Do we care? What is the impact of that gap? What will be the impact of closing the gap or not closing the gap? Is there a business case? There's a cost for closing a performance gap or an opportunity gap. Is there a business case? There's a cost. What's the benefit? We need to make clear distinctions about that. Again, for that purpose of focus. Remember, limited resources, infinite space. And then to make the change, of course, and make sure the change had an impact. So in those bottom two, the middle and the bottom layer, there we're defining what we mean by process performance, and then we're managing that performance. And those two layers I think of as active process management. I think this is what we're meant to be doing in the process management world. And of course, all of that is impossible unless we've got good models and good documentation. But the point of that documentation and modeling is, of course, to enable us to do this kind of quality active process management. That's the end game. And then the end game, the purpose of active process management, of course, is to be improving organizational performance, delivering those proven, valued business benefits, which ultimately is the purpose of all of our process work, to deliver proven, valued business benefits. Equal emphasis on all four words in that set. So just to summarize then, what should we do with all of this? I mean, seems like a lot. Well, we need to be very clear about the purpose of our modeling. I'm not saying don't model, but I'm saying be clear about why you're doing it. And doing it just because someone said we should model all of our processes is not a good reason. I'm much happier to think we're going to model just in time, not just in case. So we create models when we want to use them, not just in case we might want to use them sometime in the future, because that's probably going to be wrong by the time we got there. We need to have some measure of model quality so that we can be consistent across the organization. How what is the level of modelling quality in the organisation. We need to look at each individual process model to see what's been captured and what hasn't. We need to be able to have some uniform way of assessing that. And also that, of course, is assessing the modelling effort. So we can see where there's work to be done in terms of building modelling capability. We certainly should model within an architecture. And all process work should be done inside an architecture. And architectures are not that difficult to put together. We've done, I spent most of my life working in those kinds of projects where we're modeling, creating a process architecture and then starting to use that as a management tool. I've done that with many organizations and ES, as part of ES teams in many organizations in the kingdom, building process architectures. And many of those organizations use those to very great effect. If you're not modeling within an architecture, you're just guessing what the processes are, and guessing is not a good way to do that. Obviously, we need to keep control over the model life cycle, the documentation life cycle. We need to have some way of knowing when it was last reviewed, is the most simple thing, and have some way of some process that we can apply that makes sure that's happening on an appropriately regular basis. And it's not just about the traditional EPCs or BPMN models that we're talking about. We're actually talking about going beyond that to a very rich data set of information about the process, so that we can build that deep knowledge of what this process is supposed to be doing and who cares and what it's all about, not just boxes and arrows, but deep knowledge about the importance of the process. And we need to use this range of model types to develop that deep understanding, because once we've got that deep understanding, then we can be very effective about how it's managed. We can make good quality decisions about the process. We can start to make evidence-based decisions about where to apply our resources to which processes. You've got hundreds or perhaps thousands of processes in a process architecture, depending where you are in the hierarchy, and pretty much every process in every organization could be improved. So how do we make evidence-based decisions about where to apply those resources? So the more information we can gather and deal with and build up for perhaps more information for a smaller set of processes, I think is probably the message. It's not hundreds of processes. It's not real to think we're going to actively manage hundreds of processes. It's just not going to happen. And we don't need to. That's the good news. We can just pick those high impact processes and then do more and better modeling of a smaller number of processes. I think will give us a much better result than previously. Thank you for listening. We've got 10 minutes left here. I'd be happy to take your questions. So here's a question. AbdulRahman Halabashi says, is a process context diagram similar to a SIPOC? So short answer is yes, because you can see the SIPOC mechanism going perhaps across the middle where we have inputs and outputs. I think it's a richer model because it has those guides and enablers, I think, which is a nice thing to add to it. But the SIPOC is kind of the band that goes through the middle of the context diagram. And if you're familiar with SIPOC diagrams, or some people like to stake that backwards and call it a COPUS diagram because you're starting with the customer. So whichever way you're going, left to right or right to left, it's the centerpiece of the context diagram. And I think context diagram is better because it adds those other elements of enablers and guides, which are important for process performance. So what else? Waleed is asking how to use models in right sizing. I'm not sure if I understand that, but if by right sizing we mean identifying the number of people that we need, so that we've got, or perhaps any resources. Let me broaden it and say we want to know that we've got the optimum amount of resources, which will mainly be people that are available for the execution of a particular process. Then we can, can't we? If we've got good process documentation and we know all the various steps to execute the process, then we can look at the people that are involved, and you can capture all of that in your models, and then you can start saying that we need so many hours of this kind of person and so many of that, etc. And you can do the arithmetic, you can do the calculus of resource requirements for the process in some detail, as long as you've got a good and accurate process model, of course. Is there, ask again, Walid, if I didn't answer that properly. Another question here, is there a standard time to renew the document, to review the document? Well, if it's one of those high impact processes that we'd like to think we're under active process management, and effectively the process owner is looking at that on a pretty continuous basis. I don't think we can say, though, that there's a particular number that you can apply uniformly across the processes. It might depend on what's changing, what might be happening. Do we need to review it? Some processes are going to be much more fluid and changing than others. So I don't think we can say there's any kind of standard time. It's not like it's every 3 months or something. I think it depends on the process. Nasser is asking, when can you say the process is not suitable based on the X chart? I'm not sure if I understand that. Perhaps you could just explain that a little more for me, and I'll just move on to another question here. Peter Chi says the future of work is principle-based and that he'll burn the majority of his organisation's manuals and documents. What do you think? Yeah, good luck, Peter. Principles are important, of course. I had a conversation recently with a CEO who was telling me that we didn't want to manage and model processes, we wanted to get rid of them. Now, I think that's just a different view of what a process is. I mean, there is a view, I think a mistaken view, that people think process is what stops us getting the good stuff done. But our view surely is that processes are what lets us get anything done. And what we want to do is get rid of the poorly performing processes, just those very annoying processes. We want to get rid of those, obviously. But if you get rid of all process, then I don't know how you get work done. It depends how you define process, of course. But I think if you get rid of all of the instructions for all staff about how to do work, I don't know what happens. Someone new starts. What do? You sit them down and say, "Yeah, look, we've just do whatever you like. We don't have any instructions, so good luck with that." I don't think so. What's the impact of automation with no proper process modelling and management? Well, I think the impact is that if we're not measuring, we're not managing, we wouldn't have a clue whether we're improving. So automation for automation's sake it will deliver some benefits, but we don't know what they are. We won't be able to know how much we could spend on automation. We won't be able to prioritise which processes to automate. Not every process is automated. You can't. It's not even logical to say we'll automate the entire process architecture. There are lots of manual processes and sub-processes that remain. So if you don't understand, if you're not actively managing processes, even automated processes need to be managed. What is the performance? What's it supposed to be? What's the performance gap? All of that stuff. Automating a process is not magic. It's just IT. So if we don't have the right understanding of performance, then I don't see how we're going to do that. We're just automating because it's fun and it'll achieve some benefits, but we don't know what they are, and maybe we could have got a lot more benefit. Another question from Mohammed: in drawing a process chart, we may face alternative paths. Is there a method to decide Whether we'll draw it or not, oh boy, this is always a big issue, isn't it? How much detail we're going to put in. So I'm not these days the expert process modeler. I leave that to others to do. But my view of life would be that there is a common pathway through a process, you know, the sort of, is it the 80% case? And then there will always be exceptions. And you would get to the detail of exceptions if you need to, you know, again, just in time, not just in case. So back, NASA says, when can you say the process is not stable based on the X chart? Okay, so there are signals we look for, and the simplest one is that we have a data point that's outside of either the upper or the lower limit. And that's saying that the process is no longer operating within the limits defined by the previous data sets. So something has happened. That's a signal. Now, there's two other types of signals that we might get where we've got a continuous set of data points. In fact, 8 data points that are on one side of the central line. It just says there's something has changed. Or if we've got 3 out of 4 consecutive points that are closer to one of the limits than they are to the central line, that's also a signal that something has changed, and we need to recalculate the central line and the limits. And we can easily do that and show it on a spreadsheet. That paper that I mentioned on my website, maybe ES might want to get it and send it out to you, or even translate it at some point. Then that would be that will explain that in a little more detail. So I think we're coming up to an end here. Abdul-Latif for AbdulRahman. I think I'll hand it back to one of you.
Thank you, Roger. This was very informative. You touched on a very important subject. I know it's a very sensitive subject here in Saudi Arabia and in the region. A lot of organizations have invested and still investing in process documentation and modeling projects. I hope this presentation will change some of the decisions that are being made around these projects. Thanks again. This was very informative. Thank you for all the participants. شكرا جزيلا للحضور. شرفتونا بحضوركم، وبإذن الله راح يكون تسجيل لهذا الويبينار على حسابنا في تويتر. ابقوا معنا في سلسلة أمسية الإجراءات الشهرية. راح نكون كل فترة بإذن الله عندنا موضوع متعلق بإدارة إجراءات العمل. ابقوا معنا، هدفنا دائما نشر المعرفة في هذا المجال. شكرا جزيلا لكم. Thank you all.
Thank you. Shukran.